It's like when you fix your toilet, you shouldn't complain that your cat gets lost. Oh. Anyway, we're looking at the Acts of the Apostles, and we're not looking at it from a theological standpoint, but rather from a historical standpoint. And so, we looked at culture, and then we looked at the veracity of the Acts of the Apostles to prove that we could use the books as history. And that's what we've done. However, there's another component that we need to talk about that's very important, and that important component is how you're going to read Greek literature. Because it's Greek, right? We'll get into that. It's very important to understand that Greek literature, especially ancient literature, well, would you guess? Do you think ancient literature is written like modern literature? I suspect not, right? Otherwise, for example, do we compose literature the way we used to compose literature? Right? It's not like I'm writing on parchment, right? I'm writing on electrons. So the world has changed, and the way we write has changed. The way different cultures write is different, and that's what I want to get into. In any case, we're going to talk about logos to telos. Logos and telos. Logos to telos, most specifically. So, let's think about this. The Greek literature and Greek words are critical to our understanding. I keep giving you examples. I'm going to give you more examples today. But you got to realize that ancient words and the way the world is approached by ancient peoples is different than the way we approach the world. We have stems, fragments. We have fragments of a lot of these ancient things in our language system. In English, for example, I pointed out to you in the vitaform that we have in English, there's a vitaform in Greek. You have different forms that are evident in your language because they are fragments from the past. And just like in Greek language, for example, the classical Greek vocabulary, I'm talking about ancient world, classical ancient world Greek vocabulary has two types of words, sacred words and common words. We have sacred words and common words too, right? For example, the word angel. Can that ever, well, it is. It is used all the time euphemistically to talk about people, right? But an angel, in the sense of the word, is a sacred word in English, isn't it? Right? The same is true in Greek.
A word about sacred things.
It is a word that, when applied concretely, can only be applied to the sacred. Right? Do you see how we've lost that? Like, for example, I talk about you being an angel. Well, in ancient English, people would be kind of, wow. See? As we become more euphemistic as a culture, and we do, that's what cultures do. Cultures go from concrete to euphemistic, from concrete to less concrete. Greek is a very concrete language. So you don't see euphemistic forms in Greek generally. Plus, that would be a taboo. Right? What I'm getting at is, for example, and I wonder if I have, I've got some, I think. Anyway, let's just think about this. The world, in their view, in the worldview of the ancient Greeks, it's a pagan worldview of the universe. There's gods in everything. The world is a fearful place. Not because of natural forces, but because you can't understand the forces in it. Everything that happens because of the gods. You're sick because of the gods. I think I went through this before in the Gospels class, that every single time when we talk about sickness, the Greeks didn't really have a word for sickness. Sickness to them was a curse from the gods. It was a curse from the gods. It was a curse from a devil, a demon. It was demon possession. When you look at ancient Greek, there is no word really for illness. They did not have a concept of people being sick. And of course, we didn't even realize there were bacteria and viruses until the modern era, pretty much. Ludwig van Hooke in 1400 something, who first got that idea, and then later on, Louis Pasteur, right, in the 1800s. So our ideas, we think we're so smart, right? But if we had no idea what caused illness, what would we think? And that's the way the world was. So their language comes out of their worldview. The Greeks tried to define the world in terms of those things sacred and those things common. Because in their worldview, the things which were sacred had what kind of effect on those things that were common? An enormous effect. Let's look at some of those. For example, in a pagan society, it's necessary to placate the gods or face random retribution. That's true in the Hebrew culture, right? Hebraic culture. If you don't placate Jehovah, right? And a lot of their history in the Old Testament is a history of going from that worldview, right, to a messianic worldview. And a worldview in which Jehovah isn't the problem. See? Because in this type of culture, whose problem is it ultimately? It's always your problem, right? But who causes you the problem? The gods, right? The gods and the forces of the gods in the world. And so that's the way they think. So they tried to look at the world between these two distinct things, sacred and common. And so we get words like this. We get agape versus eros or phileo. Agape is the love from the gods, not of humans. It's just the love of the gods. It's a love gods have for other gods. It's a love that the gods could have for humans, if they looked at them. But agape is not a word that can be applied to humans. Humans can't agape. Period. On the other hand, you have these two words. Eros, which is romantic love, which isn't ever found in the New Testament. Eros is not in the New Testament. Eros is romantic love. It's not erotic love. That's pathos. And phileo, which is, I say tender love and affection. Really, remember I told you phileo is the love between shield brothers. And men, women can't have really phileo, really, according to Greeks. Women are too simple beings to have phileo in the Greek worldview. Because that's only between shield brothers. Very complex word terms here. But eros, a man and woman can have eros, although in the Greek worldview, the eros between men is more powerful than the eros between women. So, anyway, interesting, isn't it? Then you have Kronos versus Pathos. Kronos is the fate of the gods, and Pathos is the fate of man. And you notice pathos is the same word as passion. Kronos is never applied to humans. Pathos is never applied to the gods. Sacred words. This is the way the Greek worldview works. And for example, I'm going to say something that might be controversial to some of you, but for example, if in Greek I want to talk about human speech, I use the word glossolalia. That's human speech. If I want to talk about the words of the gods, I use the word omphe. Omphe is when the Delphic oracle came down and spoke. She was speaking omphe. Anytime I talk about human speech, it's always glossolalia. Anytime I speak about the speech of the gods, it's either kledon or omphe. They actually have two words for that. Kledon is the direct speech of the gods, and omphe is the speech through a human intermediary. So therefore, guess what? In the New Testament, when it talks about glossolalia, it's not talking about the speech from the gods. It's talking about human speech, but that's probably good for another class. But in any case, you have to realize that the way you interpret's not a good word. The way you understand Greek is by understanding the cultural affinity of the words. Once you understand that, you understand you're working with it. Like, for example, the glossolalia example is a beautiful one. Because when I'm talking about glossolalia, I'm always talking about human speech. When I'm talking about omphe or kledon, I'm always talking about the speech of the gods. Very important. And by the way, kledon is the direct speech of the gods. It's used and applied because a lot of statues had actually sounding instruments going through the mouths of the god. And so originally they may have been, for example, items to make the gods' statues make sounds when wind or something blew over them, for example, like air holes. But later on we know that the Greek priests, used them to speak through the mouths of the gods. And therefore they had kledon. Very interesting. I want to mention this word, baptizo. Baptizo is a derivative of bapto. Bapto means to cover wholly with a fluid. Baptizo, meaning, which is translated in most of our Bibles as baptize, right? Means literally to fully immerse, because it's the mikvah, and I'm going to mention the mikvah when we get there. Theophilus, coming from theo. Theo means God, and philos. Philos means, dear friend. Remember phileo, right? To love. Literally lover of God, or God lover, phileo. But this is a name, Theophilus. Let's talk. Those are the words of the day. We'll apply them. Let's talk a little bit about mystery religion. I need to talk a lot more about mystery religion, but because mystery religion, we had an Ephesians class here, didn't we? And I talked a lot about the mysterion, because the mysterion is what Greek religion was in this period. In the ancient world, in this period, Greek mysterion had begun around 500 BC. It was reaching its peak in about this period, about 100 AD. So the peak of mysterion, of mystery religion, that's what the Greeks believe. So the Greeks have their pantheon, all that stuff. Remember, you learned back in grade school, the cool stuff and the myths and all that. But they were moving, because of philosophy, to an idea of the mysterion. In the mysterion, they began to realize that the world was not controlled by the gods. In other words, there were natural forces. And so the point, or the ultimate focus of these mysterions, was in a natural phenomena, which may or may not have been attributable to the gods, but yet they worshiped the gods, a god. The mysterions were named after the god or the leader of the mysterion. For example, the Pythagorean mysterion, named after their leader Pythagoras, right? And their mystery was the Pythagorean theorem. The Osirian mysterion, named after Osiris, a god, an Egyptian god, their mysterion was pi, geometrically. Pi, 1.14, it keeps going forever, right? Pi. That's fun, isn't it? Well, that shows their whole geometric way of thinking, right? The mysterion of Mithras, Mithras was a god, and Mithras was the name of the mysterion, right? And they had a phallic symbol they kept in a box with a sword and a piece of grain. The Mentor also had some grain involved. We don't know what the full mysteries are, because they were kept mysteries. Part of the point of the mystery was it was a mystery. Cool. And so even today, you could be accused and killed. People would kill you for letting the mysteries out. But that's another point. But the mysterions, the religion in the Greek world, the religion in all the world, I didn't put up my usual chart. I've got that beautiful chart, the neat one that, people start with animism, gods and everything. They go to paganism, pantheonic paganism, and then they go to mysterion. Does anyone remember what the fourth step is? Gnosticism, where knowledge is religion. Which, by the way, we're kind of in a Gnostic period today. Guess who brought on the first Gnosticism in the Greek world? Christianity. The first Gnostics were Christians, which is really an interesting point. Now, Christianity saw Gnosticism as a heresy, but that's a whole different ball of wax. But in any case, this mystery religion required pilgrimages and festivals to reveal the mystery. They had music and drinking. Generally, no sexual debauchery. Our view of the Greeks is a very sexually debauched kind of group. They were, but not with religion. They didn't mix religion, and they didn't mix the sexes either. Not with religion. The women had their own, and the women did some pretty wild stuff in the Greek culture. For example, the women had this festival, and I can't remember what the goddess was. It may have been Diana. They had, I think it was Diana. But anyway, in this festival, they would literally go out and rip a boar or a pig to death, like rip it apart. And then they would sacrifice and eat it. It's still a question about whether they ate it raw or not. But the women did it. Perhaps warning the men that if you didn't treat this right, you were going to be like this pig. But, what they tended to do is separate. And unlike many Middle Eastern cultures, they did not mix, sex with everything. They tended to keep them very separate. And they had some really interesting and very sexual festivals. But guess what? No sex, because that would have been offensive to the gods. So, very interesting. I say this, it's kind of similar to the Victorian era, but worse. In other words, everything goes kind of in the symposia. The symposia they had, everything goes. I mean, they had hore. You did not invite your wives, but there's lots of female slaves and female whores, entertainers. And so, but a lot of times in the Greek worldview, they choose the young men over the women. That's part of their culture. But yet the women, are off having their kind of times to themselves. So, very interesting culture, very different kind of culture. It's not exactly what we think. And a lot of the pictures and a lot of the paintings and the ideas we have are not exactly right in the worldview. Of course, some might say that it's more common to our culture today, right? Because our culture is kind of becoming like this. But in any case, the sacrifices were gifts to the gods. We talked about that. They culminated their festival with a revelation of the mystery, and they were unknown. Likely a wonder or a miracle. Pythagorean theorem, a prophecy, an ecstatic utterance. The best example is likely from 2 Corinthians. We have some really... Go back and read 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians has some great examples of mysterion stuff. I taught it in the class. But generally, kind of a mixture. The Corinthians are a mixture of Middle Eastern culture, Moors with Greek debauchery and a lot of money to support it. So, the Corinthians were steeped in Greek mystery sects with the Middle Eastern sexual religious propensity mixed in. So that was kind of their problem. But in any case, you can imagine. Remember I talked about the Hellenized world? So you've got this Greek worldview, and you've got this Greek religious worldview, and now it is what? Moved into everybody's picture. And what do? In your culture? Do you pick, well, I don't know. You hope you pick the best aspects of your culture to save. Sometimes that's not exactly true. So when the Greek culture moved in, people probably picked some of the worst and the best aspects, and then the worst and best aspects of their own culture, and you kind of get this intermingling. But that's what happens. In any case, the Christian mystery of faith probably, and I say may have, I would say definitely, the Christian mystery of faith originated in the Christian ideal to appeal to the mysterion. Because the Christian mystery of faith, Christ is dead, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. That's what they call the mystery of faith, right? We'll look in all your prayer books and your missals and your whatever. I don't care if you're Lutheran, Methodist, Protestant, Presbyterian. The only people who don't do this are probably the anacreedal, Baptist, Anabaptist, anacreedal types. But all the creedal types, this is the thing, mystery of faith. And even if you hide it, I mean, the Anglicans and the Catholics say it right out, the mystery of faith. But sometimes like the Lutherans, we hide it in some of the hymns and stuff. But in any case, this mystery of faith comes right out of the mysterium. Very important to note. And so the Christians, and by the way, remember what I told you? That, and we'll look at this in Acts because this is mentioned in the Acts. Remember I told you that you call your mysterion after what? Your God or your leader. So guess what the Greeks called Tin Hodos? Tin Hodos is the way. They called Christians. And remember it says that the Greeks first called them Christians. Christians did not call themselves Christians in the ancient world, not until about 200 AD. Because why? It's a derogatory term to them, to the Jews, because it means a pagan mysterium. This is important, because today we just call Christian Christian. It's like a normative thing to us, right? But in the ancient world, that is not true at all. And a Christian would be very offended, especially a Jewish Christian, a Teen Hodos member would have been very offended to be called that. A lot of Paul's writing was concerning this very matter. Remember the words and the ways of thinking. So I got lots of stuff here. In ancient literature, in all ancient literature, we see a distinct difference between narratives and prophecy. Narratives and sayings, quotations. So for example, take prophecy away from it. The reason I put that up there is because Old Testament. Look in the Old Testament and see what you have. You have demarcations. Even the chapters were added, right? But you see narrative, you see sayings. In other words, when God speaks, it's listed as a total saying, right? But the narrative in the construction, that is, to put it together, what you find in ancient literature is this is almost always true. So you have, for example, Herodotus, who was a writer of history, a Greek writer of history, writing narrative. And then you have the Socratic dialogues. And the Socratic dialogues are all what? Sayings. They're all conversation. They're dialogues. And in the ancient world, this is what you see. You see a split. We see the focus in Greek is a logical argument. And for example, Herodotus wrote his history to be as a logical argument. That is, he wrote it as to a record of history. And that's what he tells us at the beginning. The Socratic dialogues are what? Logical arguments, trying to argue a point in a dialogue. In English, the way we set up our language, the way we write our language, and if you don't do this, like I always say, you need to relearn how you're writing, because we always write intro, body, conclusion, right? Remember, every paragraph is intro, body, conclusion, every paper, intro, body, conclusion. This is the way we write English. This is not the way the ancient world writes. In Hebrew, there's always parallelism. I mentioned this before, synopsis, body. So, for example, people tell me all the time, well, I read this all the time. There are two creation stories. There's two, accounts of Noah's flood. Well, yeah, because it's synopsis, body. In good Hebrew writing, ancient writing, you will always find synopsis, body. You'll find a short synopsis, then you'll find the body of the text. In Greek, you always find logical argument to a telos. And I'm going to explain what logos to telos is in a moment, but it only has body. There generally is no intro, body, conclusion. So therefore, can you read Greek literature the way you read English literature? Not at all. Can you read Hebrew literature the way you read English literature? Ancient Hebrew? Nope, not at all. Can't do it. And this is only true of the languages I've studied, because there are other forms in other languages. Hindu, except Hindi, for example. I know there are other forms, but you have to really study a language to figure out the different forms of the language and how it's put out. A logos. This is a word that is translated either say or said. And I told it to you before, I think. This is the word that in John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. It's logos. But logos doesn't mean word. Logos means literally a topic, a reasoning, or a computation. Literally in the Greek, a logos is a logical argument. That's the easiest way to explain it. Period, dot. That's what it means. So in a logos, when a Greek person in the ancient world tells you, I'm giving you a logos, it means I'm giving you a logical reasoning. I'm giving logical reasoning. There are 8 words, other words that mean it, and I don't think I listed them. There's 8 other words that can be translated say or said. And the Greeks will tell you, if I'm telling you an opinion, or telling you a logical argument, or if I'm just making small talk, it's lelo. If I'm just giving you a story, they have different words for every single way of communicating what they're trying to say to you. They're all translated say or said, unfortunately. A telos, literally a telos, is a vanishing point, either the beginning or end. A telos roughly translates to a conclusion. But literally, it is the reason or end of a concept of a logos. The greatest example is Aesop's fables. I mentioned this to you. I love this Aesop's fable example because this is a perfect example. Aesop's fable is a logos to telos. It's an argument to a telos. The morals were added later by the Romans. The Romans didn't want you to miss it. The Greek worldview was that the morals were implicit. And if you put them in, you would detract from the argument. Right? It would be a conclusion. They didn't put it in because The most important thing in the Greek view wasn't the telos, it was the logos, the logical argument that led to it. In other words, the logical argument should be clear enough that when you just read it, you automatically get the telos. So they don't list teloses in Greek literature. That's the point. The New Testament writers were writing first-person accounts of immediate events. They required quotations within the narratives. They were writing a logos to telos. The narration was required to give the context. And so you get, as a comparison in the New Testament documents, this isn't in the New Testament documents. Anybody heard the Gospel of Thomas? The Gospel? It's, well, supposed sayings of Jesus. It is a sayings gospel, there's no context. And it's a very ancient gospel. It's an ancient text, very ancient text. If I were to read, anybody read the Gospel of Thomas? I should have brought a copy. It's really difficult to understand. It's just sayings. It's like if I just took the sayings of Jesus and gave them to you. You know, no context. So and by the way, the Gospel of Thomas is similar to a dialogue, a Greek dialogue. It is a Greek dialogue. It's a Greek document. It's not really a dialogue, but it's a context of a dialogue. Remember what I told you before? Narratives and sayings in ancient literature? So, to incorporate the history of the times, the New Testament required a new type of literature. If you ever read C.S. Lewis, you know one of C.S. Lewis's big points as a expert in literature is that this was the point he wrote about all the time. That the New Testament documents were a new type of literature. Because what did they incorporate together? Narratives and sayings in the same document. So what we have is we have a Greek document that's a logos to telos, but in Acts, and by the way in the Gospels, what we have is we have logos to telos documents that are narrative documents intermeshed with dialogue. This is the first time this has happened in the world. I mean, you can find some other ancient documents that have some similar constructions, but not many. This is literally a new genre. This genre was undefined. It is a form of literature that is specific to the Gospels. The Gospels are the beginning. And by the way, the Gospels and Acts are basically the beginnings of all modern literature. Why is that? All modern literature incorporates what? Narrative with sayings. So, we couple this together. We have this new genre with a Greek literature form that is a logos to telos. It drives to a logical conclusion. The Greek writers were not interested in unimportant peripheral details, so Greek writing drives to a telos, always. The point is this: what you don't see in Greek literature, you don't see peripheral detail, you don't see side explanations, you don't see multiple storylines. Each part is a piece of the whole. You don't see wordy or unnecessary description. Each word is carefully chosen to drive to the telos. You don't see multiple explanations. Once is enough. For example, we have two examples of Paul's sermons in Acts. We have a sermon to the Gentiles and a sermon to the Greeks. No more than one each. Why? I don't need to give you more than one. Right? That's the Greek worldview. That's the way the Greeks thought. As I said, for example, you know, one of the things people always bring up to me is say, well, there's in the different gospel accounts, you have different numbers of people going to the tomb. Well, what was the point of the Greek writing? We have to go look at the logos to telos to figure out what is the point of the logical argument to the conclusion. Because in the Greek worldview, does it matter how many people went to the tomb? No, they don't care. They don't care. It's not like English where we really care about the details of the point. There's no need. Or, for example, side explanations. You know, the guy that they grabbed